Former Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhail Fedorov came out of the shadows and gave a major interview in which he admitted that his resignation was not related at all to his conflict with Alexander Syrsky. The real reason is total corruption and the fact that his ministry began dismantling the war profiteering schemes of many shady arms manufacturers who were happily siphoning off budgets. But, as it turned out, this is just the beginning, and there is already a sense that the interview was released right in time for the protest announced for Friday. The publication Ukrainska Pravda has published only the first part of a large interview with the former Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Mikhail Fedorov. His first detailed conversation about his own resignation 2 weeks after being dismissed. This interview is significant because Fedorov, for the first time, moves away from the narrative of a personal conflict with Commander-in-Chief Syrsky, a version he and President Volodymyr Zelensky previously mentioned, and instead cites a different reason: defense procurement reform, which, according to him, affected the interests of many people and companies. The interview comes out 2 days before a new protest march scheduled in Kiev for Friday, July 31st. And this is clearly not a coincidence, and Mikhail Fedorov is clearly entering the political fray. In this episode, we'll take a detailed look at Mikhail Fedorov's statement with all the necessary background, and separately, we will look at the issue of clan struggles around the defense market and the political future of Fedorov himself. In general, there will be enough about Fedorov. In general, it will be quite interesting. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, please subscribe to this YouTube channel. We are moving toward the 300,000 subscriber mark, so I will be grateful for each of your subscriptions. Make yourself comfortable. It will be interesting. And most importantly, stay until the end. There are a lot of fascinating details there.
You can't develop and hold high positions in a country if you don't have a defense campaign. Of course, everyone's attention is always focused on this. So who do you support? Which way are you leaning? Thank you.
So, as always, let's break everything down step by step. Let's start with the chronology of how it all happened. On July 14th, let me remind you, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine supported the resignation of the government of Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko. As a result, the entire cabinet of ministers automatically resigned. On July 15, Mikhail Fedorov confirmed that he was leaving the post of Minister of Defense. On July 16, protests began in Kiev and other cities demanding his return to the ministry. And by the way, they have already been going on for almost 2 weeks. On July 20, Volodymyr Zelensky signed a decree appointing the new commander-in-chief, Mikhail Dropatov, who replaced Alexander Syrsky. And already on July 31, the organizer of the protests, veteran Dmytro Kozyatinsky, announced a new protest march from the Shevchenko Monument to Ivan Franko Square near the president's office in Kiev. And it was right before the announced protest march that Mikhail Fedorov decided to break his silence. This is clearly not a coincidence, and I have to say it directly. And that's why we move on to the main question of this interview, which is asked by the Ukrainska Pravda journalist Mikhailo Tkach. What is the real reason for your dismissal from the post of Minister of Defense? And now, a direct quote from Mikhailo Fedorov. I didn't want to speculate about this. I didn't want to recount the conversations I had with the president. There is nothing new there that hasn't already been made public. First of all, it was said that there is a certain conflict, but in general, I think the reasons actually lie elsewhere. A lot of people surrounded the Ministry of Defense and me as the minister because we started restructuring many different processes inside. And from what began to happen in the public space, certain pressure, certain law enforcement agencies around our work. Around the beginning of April, it became clear that the tension was rising and that this would end somehow. Then Fedorov directly names the source of this pressure, quote, "The reason is connected to procurement, to tenders, to the fact that we started restructuring processes in this direction. This caused great dissatisfaction among many major weapons manufacturers, who began to constantly exert influence to spread negativity not only around the president, but also across the media more broadly." After that, journalist Mikhail Tkach asks a direct question. is it true that many people, in one way or another connected to politically influential figures, are not interested in creating a transparent arms procurement market? And do they want to keep siphoning off huge amounts of money from this? Fedorov's answer goes like this, quote, I think it has a right to exist. Really, a lot of people in our country are connected to the defense industry business. To be continued. There really were a lot of different signals. Many events occurred in the Ministry of Defense. In my 7 years of working in the government, I couldn't imagine that there could be people in the Ministry of Defense appointed as department heads by private companies. This reflects law enforcement's influence over the process. That is, how far the process is already underway internally. Here it's necessary to explain a bit of the background, which Fedorov himself doesn't directly clarify, but which explains the context of his words. This is about the case known as the Mindich tapes. Timur Mindich, a businessman whom the press describes as close to Volodymyr Zelensky. He became a figure in an investigation by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine into the energy sector, which also involves the Minister of Justice, formerly the Minister of Energy, Herman Halushchenko. Later, the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office also linked Mindich to the defense sector and to former defense minister. And now, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Rustem Umerov, who just the day before yesterday was calmly sitting next to Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office of the White House at a meeting with Donald Trump. So in the recordings that appear in the Mindich case, there are recorded calls from that very Timur Mindich to Rustem Umerov demanding that he accept a batch of body armor that bullets could penetrate, as well as a meeting in Umerov's private apartment with that same Mindich, official Jumadilov, and the supplier of these same bulletproof vests. Rustem Umerov himself stated that attempts to link his work in the Ministry of Defense to the influence of any individuals are unfounded, but he did admit to meeting with Mindich, specifically regarding the contract which was later terminated due to the product not meeting the requirements. This case is the public backdrop for Fedorov's remarks about people tied to the defense business. And then, in the interview, the name of the head of the presidential faction Servant of the People, Dmytro David Arakamia, is mentioned. As an active representative of the interests of certain arms manufacturers, who could have directly influenced Fedorov's resignation. And so when he's asked about Arakamia's role, Fedorov gives an evasive answer, but not a negative one. Quote, I wouldn't want to mention specific names, there were no direct threats, so basically everyone knows about me, they know my position, on this or that issue. I think the fundamental problem is that a very large number of high-ranking officials cannot imagine that you can hold a high position in the government and not have ties to the defense business. You can change the rules of the game, you can open up markets, you can help markets develop, and at the same time not have your own interests in that market. This is a cultural and value-based problem that arises today and affects the making of technical or other decisions. It's important to emphasize here that this is still not a direct accusation against David Arakamia. Fedorov refuses to name names and talks about this as a systemic problem and not as pointing to a specific person. Since this is just the first part of the interview, I wouldn't be surprised if, in the future, during the political struggle, Fedorov starts mentioning specific names. As you can see, he's raising the level of escalation very gradually. When asked why President Zelensky has effectively taken the side of these groups in the defense sector during this conflict, Fedorov answers, quote, we don't know the final reason for the dismissal. I think that when 90 people come to you, to Zelensky, and say, there's something wrong there, there's some kind of problem, then maybe it's hard to see reality objectively under such pressure. And then he adds an important detail, quote, but sometime in April, I warned the president, look, now people will come to you and say that something is wrong with me. That I have a drone business, companies, that I disrupted some processes. You have to cross-check this information because I threaten the interests of many people and companies, and I need your support here. That is, Mikhail Fedorov is saying directly that he warned that he is breaking up the old defense sector market and that Zelensky shouldn't fall for all these smears. He says that back in April, he warned the president that people would come to him and start complaining, saying, "How could this be? We were making millions of bucks selling weapons." Now, some guy named Fedorov came in and is disrupting this scheme. Next is a quote about how the information pressure campaign worked. You can see that the largest Telegram channels in Ukraine have been bought out, and they started working solely against me and my company. Cases started being brought against people who work with me. That is, this pressure was increasing every month, and under such pressure, continuing to carry out reforms, well, in the end, we see that this led to a change of government and to the fact that today I am no longer in office. Next, in response to a direct question whether he believes that the government's resignation was a cover for his dismissal, Fedorov replies, then he says, and I quote, "It seems so. Unfortunately, we lost oil. Several serious managers during this change, including Yulia Sviridenko." So, Fedorov confirms this version that, in general, the entire cabinet was dismissed simply because they needed to remove Fedorov. But it was impossible to say directly that we are removing Fedorov because he disrupts the markets and prevents certain people from making money on the war. So they decided that they are simply changing the government's strategy. Next is a moment that characterizes Volodymyr Zelensky's own approach to forming the cabinet of ministers. A quote from Fedorov. "Half an hour or an hour before the Servant of the People faction meeting, I was informed that Klimenko's candidacy would be submitted for the position of Minister of Defense. When asked if the president did it personally, Fedorov answers briefly, yes." Mikhail Fedorov speaks in detail and with careful wording about the conflict with Alexander Syrsky itself, using phrases that differ from what was previously stated publicly. Here is his quote. "In fact, we never really had a personal conflict with the commander-in-chief. It's more of an ideological conflict. We have a certain vision of the war that we came in with. But this vision breaks down into specific reforms, projects and operations that need to be implemented. We, as the Ministry of Defense, have not blocked a single decision of the General Staff or the Commander-in-Chief. That was the position both as a citizen and as the Minister of Defense. Despite the ideological conflict, not to block any process in the army." In response to the claim that President Zelensky publicly stated that the minister and the commander-in-chief did not sit down to talk to each other without his participation, Fedorov answers evasively, saying he can't comment on that. In reality, we had a large number of meetings, briefings and calls. Of course, we were working normally, but then, when asked the follow-up question, "Without the president?" Fedorov briefly answers, of course. So, after all, Fedorov and Syrsky could work even without the president's involvement. When asked why President Zelensky ultimately chose Syrsky and not him, Fedorov avoids giving a direct answer. And here is a direct denial. Rumors about an ultimatum from his side. Quote, "I did not issue any ultimatum. I left the talks together with the government." Then the protests began. About the positions offered to him after his resignation, Fedorov says this, "I was offered a number of positions, and I simply said that I have a certain vision, that I know how to carry forward. Wherever I am, I will follow this vision. I will not take any ceremonial position. I see myself as a manager who knows how to build systems and achieve results." Separately, Fedorov explains why he refused the position of Deputy Prime Minister for Defense and Innovation. And in fact, he simply confirms an obvious truth. Fedorov says, a Deputy Prime Minister without a ministry is essentially like an advisor who can only give advice to the system. Influence it, but you don't have the ability to form a team or impact the real result. That's why it's more of a decorative position. About his team and relationship with the president, Fedorov now says briefly, "We didn't have a final conversation with the president. We didn't have a falling out. There was no agreement that we would stop communicating. From my point of view, communication is still ongoing. But the problem is that Zelensky himself is already saying that the issue with Fedorov is closed. A separate substantive part of the interview is about the appointment of Dropatov as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. When asked if he was the one who suggested this candidate to the president, Fedorov replies, "My key suggestion to the president was to meet with different commanders. With the corps commanders, possibly some brigade and troop group commanders, to look at everyone and make the decision independently. As for Dropatov, I was the one who suggested him. And right here, sorry, it's not clear at all what's going on. Or rather, it's clear, but let's break it down from a different angle. We discussed that Volodymyr Zelensky actually held these kinds of meetings with commanders, with commanding officers, and basically did everything just as Mikhailo Fedorov is describing now. If Fedorov really advised the president on this and the president acted accordingly, the question is, why get rid of him, of someone like Mikhailo Fedorov? Next, Fedorov lays out in detail his own vision of the war plan, divided into 4 key areas. The first is the air domain. That is, intercepting everything in the sky, the creation of short-range air defense systems that identify every target and, in fact, create an impenetrable dome. Second is land, that is, on the ground, to stop the enemy's advance on the battlefield, to achieve the destruction of 200 Russians for every square kilometer of captured territory. To complete the core reform, solve the mobilization problem, increase the destruction of Russians to 50,000 per month, replacing our people on the battlefield with technology. 3. Economy, what President Zelensky calls long-range sanctions. That is, the fight against the shadow fleet and, in general, sanctions against the Russian economy. 4. Cognitive warfare. That is, building win-win relationships with partners, so it's not about give us something or help us. No, you're not helping us. We are partners with you. Partners. 5. Victory over Russia in every technological cycle. Recording everything in real time and, as a separate point, the fight against corruption. Fedorov talks about the mobilization reform as a funnel. Here is his quote. "We need to look at mobilization as a kind of funnel, where there is a final product. This is military service, where there are certain conditions and clear terms of service, salary, and the opportunity to advance within it." He mentions opening up the market to foreigners at the front. Quote, "I believe that more than 50 on the front line among the assault troops could be foreigners. We are now seeing this in the Zaporizhia sector. A large number of soldiers from African countries are fighting on Russia's side. In some sections of the front, there are even more of them than Russians themselves. And most importantly, according to Fedorov, the mobilization reform was supposed to be fully launched in August-September. And as for the question of his political ambitions, in the interview itself, Fedorov states directly, "I have never fought for positions, I never wanted to be a minister, I don't dream about it. I am a manager who knows how to build a system and ecosystems. The main thing for me is to show results." Well, that's quite a nice, evasive answer. But it's worth noting that in political circles, the possibility of creating a new party led by Mikhail Fedorov is currently being discussed. However, people in his circle claim that he is not planning to enter politics yet. Let me remind you that they said exactly the same thing about Zaluzhny. And then he said, well, listen, if the people are asking, then why not? Now let's address the question of why this interview appeared right now. It seems pretty simple to me. The interview was published on the evening of July 29. Today, July 30, it will be pushed as hard as possible. And on July 31, a new protest march has been announced in Kyiv. And here it's important to note that the organizers of the protest actually called for refraining from daily rallies to gather their strength specifically for Friday's march. So, from a factual point of view, the interview came out 2 days before the major protest event. and it objectively supports the protest agenda. Moreover, it gives the protesters new, more detailed arguments on the eve of the protest march. In my view, it's obvious that the publication of the interview was coordinated with the organizers of the protest. Speaking of interests for Mikhail Fedorov himself, this publication is beneficial in that it shifts the focus of public discussion from Fedorov's personal conflict with Syrskyi to an institutional problem. Like, who is blocking reforms to protect their own money? That is, who is hindering, in general, the building of a state governed by the rule of law, who tried to profit from the war, and so on. And this, as you can imagine, is more advantageous. This is a frame for a politician who wants to preserve their reputation as a reformer, regardless of his future career, to cement this idea in their minds. And for the protest movement, the interview provides a fresh, meaningful reason ahead of the July 31st march. For Zelensky's presidential team, on the contrary, such a publication is very disadvantageous, because it supports the narrative that the decision was made under influence of interest groups rather than for objective military reasons. And it hints at the possible role of the head of the presidential faction, David Arakamia. And most importantly, now the protest will press the president even harder. Why don't you communicate with us about dismissals or appointments of ministers? Why don't you explain publicly what is really happening? Because Fedorov said it outright. What you were told, that there was a conflict between Fedorov and Syrskyi, that's all nonsense. The real reason for the resignation is entirely different. For a defense market company whose interests, according to Fedorov, were affected by the procurement reform, publicity is doubly disadvantageous for them. Because now this topic is not just based on rumors, but on what the former defense minister said directly. What will happen next? The first scenario: the interview and the upcoming march on July 31 increase the pressure on President Zelensky's team, demanding a more transparent explanation of personnel decisions in the defense sector. Fedorov himself says directly in the interview that society will no longer allow, quote, making decisions behind closed doors. The second scenario: the topic remains a media discussion without any organizational consequences. Since Zelensky's team believes that the protests will simply die down over time, and now Fedorov is totally off limits, she absolutely cannot be allowed back into power. Because then it would look like Zelensky is weak and just gave in to Fedorov's blackmail. Because right now he looks like a pretty strong figure who came out and said, okay, I'll only be the Minister of Defense and nothing else. If Zelensky brings him back to this position, he becomes weak. And the third, more distant scenario is if the political ambitions of Mikhail Fedorov, contrary to his own words in the interview, still take shape as a political party. This could become a new fault line in Ukraine's internal political struggle. But at the moment, these are just behind-the-scenes rumors, not an announced intention. So it's quite possible that there will be a new party, but for now it doesn't exist. The conclusion of this episode will be simple. The interview with former Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhail Fedorov was released now specifically to reignite the protests, which had started to die down. This also needs objective discussion. The fact that Mikhail Fedorov openly says that he went up against the weapons cliques, who make huge amounts of money from the war, is a direct blow to Zelensky. Because Ukraine, let me remind you, not so long ago received a loan of 90 billion euros, of which, by the way, 60 billion of that is spent on defense. That is, these 60 billion euros will be spent specifically on weapons. And Fedorov suddenly tried to change this market. And what's important, Fedorov publicly shared his vision of the war. And from a political strategy point of view, this is a good move for political struggle in the style of, I told you how it should be done. And you just went and fired me, but if you had done as I said, the result would have been different. And if they do it the way I said, he'll say, see, that was my plan all along. So the struggle is actually just beginning. I'll leave it at that. Friends, I ask you to support this YouTube channel financially with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. I would be grateful for any support you can give. Subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to the Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link is in the description of this video. Be sure to like this video. Share the link to this episode on your social media, because I think this is a very important topic. Well, friends, click the bell so you don't miss new episodes on this YouTube channel. That's all. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.